Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 645. Today we're going to talk about the Mother of Dragons expansion for the Game of Thrones board game. Now this was originally released, I think, back in 2003 or so. Now this is the second edition that I have here, and I've done a review of this one. I'll put a link to that review where I go over the mechanics in a little bit more detail. In this video, I'm not going to go over, the mechanics at all, really, except for some of the new additions and things, the new board, the new player faction you can play as the Targaryens, and so on. So I'm just going to jump right into the changes and the updates and the improvements, spoiler, and then I'll come back and tell you what I think about it. Okay, so I've gone ahead and laid out the new board. You can see that here. Of course, over here we've got the original board that comes with the base game. There's a couple other things over here. We got some new cards and stuff. Obviously, new pieces for the Targaryen player. These are purple. You also get some blue ones from House Aaron. But most importantly, you get 3 dragon kind of meeples here for House Targaryen. Now, these start off very weak. They start off with a strength of 0. So you really don't want to get them into combat because when these die, they are dead. You don't get to bring it back. Whereas everybody else, just like in the base game, if I've got my knights and foot soldiers there, if those dies, of course, I can muster them back into the game. But once one of these is dead, it's gone for good. Now, at the bottom of this new board here, you have the sort of dragon strength track. And you can see here, as the turns go by, you're going to take and put one of these markers on here. So as the dragons grow and get bigger and start to breathe fire and all that kind of fun stuff, they're going to increase in strength. Where finally, on the 10th and final turn of the game only, they're going to be at a strength 5, which is very, very strong because these suckers, of course, can fly basically wherever they want. So if you packed all 3 of them into the same region, that's 15 attack power right then. And if you lose one, I might get stabbed by some players, but who cares if you lose a dragon? So they're very effective. And the other reason that they're effective is that the Targaryen player has a different way of winning the game. So here you can see the score track, right? And most players, they'll have their little token like this, and then the first one here to get to 7 is going to instantly win the game, or if at the end of 10 rounds, whoever has the most will win the game. But you're going to track victory for the Targaryens in a different way. It's a little bit harder for them at the beginning of the game to get victory points, but as the game goes along and you kind of let them build up power, it becomes easier, and they can never actually lose the victory points. So the way that this works is they'll start down here at 1, and then as they collect these loyalty tokens here, they will gather them in different ways, and then they will start to move up this track. And of course, you can never take them away because once they're gathered, and then that's it. Whereas most players are trying to control castles and strongholds so they can kind of move up and down as they lose territory. Now, the Targaryens also have another drawback to kind of hinder them, definitely at the beginning of the game. So here you can see, of course, the 3 tracks. You've got the Iron Throne, the Fiefdoms, and the King's Court. They can never be at the front of this. And as a matter of fact, they're always in last there. You can see their token there is always in the 8th spot. Now you can see they always get to use the special action tokens. If you're not familiar with the game, you get sort of order tokens that you can give out. Everybody gets kind of a bunch of generic ones, and you get some special ones. They can always use 3, so that's good, but they can never break ties or get this sword for battle and so on and use the special ability of the crows. But when they go to bid their power tokens, remember, if you remember at the first game, you can bid on power tokens here to move up the various different tracks. They can bid tokens and they'll give them and add them to the total for other players. So they can still influence it and, try to make deals and so on. Now, the reason that the Iron Throne track here is so important is because you have the concept of vassals. Once you add the expansion, you have vassals, not Tom Vassal, like vassals in the medieval sense. So I should say, when you're playing with the full 8 players, you're not going to use any vassals. However, if players decide to drop out of the game, then you can just have them act as vassals and just, sort of take on sort of like a little dummy player kind of thing. So like I said, the first player on the Iron Throne track can take control of the first available vassal, and they'll be able to use them. This is a card here that gives you a setup for how to set up their forces and so on. You're going to take the cards for that particular house, this is the Lannister house, out of the game, And instead, you're going to use this stack of mercenary cards. So when you go to do a combat, because you've ordered this vassal maybe to attack, or they've been attacked by somebody else, you're always just going to shuffle up this deck, draw 3, and then choose 1 to play, and then you just keep doing that every time you're going to do that. And so this has some of your favorite characters from the books there. Jon Cunnington, Jaqen H'ghar, Varys, there he is, Bronn, which is my second favorite character. And so you use that for combat. Now, the way that you give them orders is each house, not the Targaryens though, they can't be vassals, has a little set of vassal order tokens. So after everybody's done placing their normal order tokens on the board, then you get a chance to place 2 of the vassal tokens on the areas where that force is. The only other rules are that you can't, of course, attack a vassal that you control, because you couldn't set up like a foil just to kind of get an easy victory. But you can move them in and attack other places, and you can have them muster in different ways. There's a couple of little idiosyncrasies with the rules on that. But what this does is fills up the board with, effectively different players. There's not a bunch of dead neutral areas. It kind of fixes, spoiler, the player count. So when you play with 4 players, you're still going to have all the houses in play, and so on. So again, after everybody places their normal order tokens, you're going to place 2 vassal tokens in turn order in this case, and then go through and execute them. They do have a place on the initiative track, so you're going to execute them in the same order as well. And there's a little bit of a setup where they kind of like drop off the top. So that doesn't make sense that they would be at the top. But yeah, there's just a couple little minor rules with that. But the spoiler for the review, this really is probably, if not as cool as the Targaryens, maybe even cooler of a fix for the game. Because again, you could play it at the various different player counts in a little bit better form. But I'll talk more about that part in the review. Now, speaking of the order tokens here, players are going to get these here with sort of a gray background, as opposed to the kind of the black one there. These can only be placed in the ocean. Okay, these are ocean only, because there's a little bit more ocean spaces with the new board and everything. Now, this one in particular is for sort of dealing with the Iron Bank and kind of getting a shipment from them. And this is a really cool addition, but I could see players kind of taking or leaving it. Let me show you how this works. So you're going to place this order token down, and then you can see it activates during the kind of the collect power phase. So when it comes to your turn here, you can activate this to deal with the Iron Bank. And the Iron Bank is here at the top of the new board. Now you only start with 1 of these at the beginning of the game face up, but then these will kind of shift down to get cheaper over the course of rounds. And then you can see here is the power token cost for taking this thing. So if you take this one, for example, you'll be able to wipe out instantly a knight and a footman. Or this one here will give you plus 10 power tokens and so on. There's a bunch of really cool abilities. But when you take this, you're going to turn this over and leave this face up and face down in front of you for the rest of the game. So every round, you have to pay a power token sort of as interest for the rest of the game. There's no way to sort of get out of that. If you can't pay it, then the player who is at the top of the war track, who has that sword, they get to pick any unit of yours that they want and kill it. And so it's just going to wipe them out. So you don't want that to happen. But as you see, as the game goes along, these get super cheap. You players will hopefully have more income and so on of power, so it'll be a little bit more attractive to buy those, especially as the game goes along, and give you kind of that nudge. The Iron Bank kind of like backing. They can see one faction maybe has a little bit of an ability to, bring stability to the realm and all that kind of stuff. So it gets much more attractive as the game goes on. So these next sets of cards, they aren't part of the expansion, but I just kind of throw them out there if people are watching this and just get kind of your gauge on it. So one rule, though, in the expansion is if you have the Dance with Dragons and the Feast of Crows expansions, you can take both of these and then combine them, because you've got House Aaron cards in here, and then, of course, all the other factions in here. And so you kind of play a different setup, supposedly. But the thing in the rules, it just tells you to take the cards from here and here, and you don't use the cards from the base game. And then you can see there's actually, let's see if I can show you there, an A and a B. There's actually 2 decks of these Targaryen cards. So if you're playing just a normal game, you're going to use the A cards. But if you decide to kind of like move into the future here, into later books as your starting point, then you're going to take these and you're going to take the B cards here for Targaryen. So like Daenerys here is sort of weak ish. She's pretty good. She's still pretty good. She's only 1 power, but she gets a little bit more power by herself, and then she has this ability: after combat, your opponent must discard a number of the available power tokens equal to the difference in the final combat strength. So you can see if she's riding in there with a bunch of dragons and just demolishing people, she's also making them really poor. So she's a little bit nasty there, and like there's no Khal Drogo in the B deck because, spoilers, he doesn't exist in the B deck. I don't want to spoil anything, but he is there in the A deck if you're playing with that. So what I'm curious about is the rules don't actually tell you to do the setup like you would do for Dance with Dragons. They just tell you to do the cards differently, which, I don't know. I mean, that's fine, but when you play Dance with Dragons by itself, the faction's actually set up in completely different parts of the board. So I'm a little bit interested if they meant to have you do the setup in that way, or you still do the original base game setup, you just do the new cards. I'm curious. I don't know. The way I'm reading it, you just do the base game setup and the new cards, which is fine. It's just less thematic, but still, I mean, maybe there's a problem if you do the new setup. The other thing is it doesn't make any mention of these cards. Now, these come with the base game, and these are ways of kind of adding randomizers to the combat. We haven't played with these with the expansion, but I'm kind of gone back and forth with these. I think I'm leaning not to ever use these again, but I'm curious what people's thoughts on that actually might be. Because I kind of don't think you need it, because you have the vassals now, so you've got those extra forces that can add assistance and support to combat, so it kind of varies things up enough. Where I did like to play, like when we play with 3 players, sometimes you didn't really have a whole lot of support and stuff, so this made the game a little bit more interesting at a lower player count, which I don't think is actually needed anymore. So that's kind of a roughshod gist of all the new changes. Let's go back up to my face and see what I think. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the Mother of Dragons expansion. So let's do kind of my 3 pillars of reviewing. I don't think I've done an expansion since I started doing this. So the first 2 kind of always go hand in hand is player count and play time. Well, obviously, I kind of mentioned during the walkthrough bit, and spoil I think in the intro, was that this kind of fixes the player count issues that the base game has. And it also, I didn't actually mention this, there's actually some tokens here. You can see that is a new token for the Eyrie, and this actually adds a port to the Eyrie. So that fixes the Eyrie, kind of fixes House Aaron, which before you only could play with the Feast of Crows expansions, which is bad. I do not like that expansion at all. That's the only thing, I hate that expansion. There's some broken things where like you can be attacked from the sea and stupid stuff. But that adds a port, which is cool for this thing. And I wonder, though, if you could play Feast of Crows just with that. Because Feast of Crows has some cool stuff with objectives and things. But I wonder if you could play that with this added. It doesn't really mention that in the rule book either. And like I said, it doesn't mention how exactly to work with those other 2 expansions in there. But forget about the expansions, just kind of playing the base game plus this expansion. It fixes dramatically all the player count issues. The vassals, they add in all this extra stuff, so there's no neutral areas. It makes the bidding and stuff way more intriguing, even more intriguing. It was still intriguing, but it's still way more intriguing because you're now vying for control of, let's say the Baratheons are being controlled by the Tyrells, and they're just harassing the heck out of you, and you've got to deal with that. So maybe you go to bid the Iron Throne so you can kind of move them out of the way and so on. And it becomes like a real negotiation point as well, where like, okay, Billy, if you take control of this, then can you move them to attack Frankie or whatever? And, then that allows me to do this. Yes, I'm going to get a point here, but Frankie's in the lead by 2 strongholds or whatever. So, it becomes a real cool, interesting point of negotiation. And I think the vassals is definitely, I don't know, I really like the Targaryen stuff because it's a very asymmetric faction. But the vassals to me is probably the most important fix to this. Now let's talk about the Targaryens. Oh wait, so let's talk about playtime. Playtime, this game has, I would say you're looking at 3. I haven't played with the expansion with 3 players, but I've played 3 players enough to know that the expansion probably would add a little bit of time to it, just because of that extra layer of activating the vassals and negotiating and thinking like that. So I think you're going to look at a solid 2.5 to 3 hours, even at the 3-player count, up to, I can't imagine playing this with 8. that's going to take you a while. I have had a game, I think it was 5 or 6, I don't remember. It was 5 or 6 players in it. We went about 5 hours, or maybe a little bit more. So, although that was an exceptionally slow game, I have played it with 5 or 6. I can't remember. I played this a few times now. 5 or 6, and we were done in less than 4. But that was because most people were familiar and it wasn't a lot of AP. Just it kind of depends on who's playing. If Billy's playing, it'll probably take like 10 hours. But so with 8 though, I could see that going up to 6 hours for sure. What's the box say? Does the box give me a playtime on this? 2 to 4 hours. Yeah. I don't see 8 players going like 3 hours or 4 hours. So anyway, if you played an 8-player game in most things, it's going to take you a long time. So I would ballpark this at kind of, obviously depending on player count, 3 to 6 hours, depending. I do want to play it with 8. I mean, I really like this game. I like the theme. I like the TV show. I like the books, all that nonsense. So this is going to fit into that sort of Twilight Imperium sort of arena once you get up to 6, 7, 8 players as well. So, but with the player count, I played it with 4 with the expansion and the vassals and stuff. Like I said, I haven't played with 3. That still took us 3 hours, but there were some new players that had never played the game. And I think next time, if I played it with that same group again, it would go much, much quicker, just because you can kind of get through those first couple of turns faster, because those first couple of turns can be slow with players who don't know what they're doing. But then the game's going to pick up anyway because there's just more precise points of interest, so that certain things you can just kind of block out. You don't have to like absorb the entire map and everything. So anyway, enough about player time and player count and all that stuff. And the last pillar of review is like, what could I compare this to? Now, this is interesting. So if you've not played Game of Thrones, this is very much like a game of diplomacy. It's got some Twilight Imperium vibes to it. It's got, there's another game I'm trying to think of that's like diplomacy. It's like this. It's got some sort of civilization-y kind of vibes where you're getting territory and building armies, and then you've got some abstract economy stuff with the different power tokens that you can generate. But it's very much Game of Thrones, the game, obviously. It's just, there's a lot happening in terms of kind of the different layers of things going on. You've got the whole wildling invasion stuff. You've got, alliances and deal-making between the players. You do miss out on, and the one kind of complaint that I've heard about with this game, as far as what makes Game of Thrones special as an intellectual property or a TV show or a book, is the personal, characters and their dynamics. The dynamic between Cersei and Jaime, and between Tyrion and Jon Snow, stuff like that. So those moments are why the books and the TV show, I think, do so well, is because you have those kinds of moments and stuff. You don't really get that here. You have the player cards and stuff, and it's got a kind of a Kemet thing where if you play, one character card to do the combat, then you can't use it for a while, and you've got to play through all your cards and dig them back up. The one thing that's interesting about this, actually, is when you go and fight the vassals, that can be an interesting way to, if you kind of get behind the 8 ball with those cards, and you're like, oh, well, dang it. I need these cards. I wanted to win that combat. I don't want to just throw it away, so I'm going to use a good card, but now I don't have that good card for a long time, where you can go through and kind of cycle your deck a little bit more safer way. Because, okay, the vassals bother me, and I can just go in and lose to them. No big deal. But I can get my cards back quicker, and then I'll save them up and then use them against another player towards the end of the game, where it's way more important. Whereas before, if you did that against a player, it's like, well, that person might get closer to victory if I lose this combat. I can eat the loss, but I don't want them getting closer to victory. Whereas the vassal, they're not going to win. So, okay, I can lose. So that's an interesting new dynamic there, where you can kind of throw stuff at the vassals in different ways and just kind of push back on them. That's a real interesting kind of dynamic layer, where you're sort of forcing the other player's attention a little bit towards using the vassals to hinder you, in a mental space, not in a necessarily game space. And so you get them to kind of do that stuff, and then so you can kind of play around with that and get through your cards quicker, and just it's interesting. It's kind of hard to describe, but it's a way that you can grind through your cards and sort of hint and feint at different things that you're trying to do. So there's some good manipulation and stuff that you can do with that. Like I kind of mentioned in the walkthrough, the Iron Bank, I really like this edition. I don't know, I'd have to go reread the rulebook there. I don't know if you could just take it out and not use it, but I would be interested to see if, players wanted to do that, because I can see some instances where if you get that right Iron Bank card, because you've built up like some power tokens and things, that the Daenerys player, the Targaryen player, because they can kind of make some quick strikes at the end to get some of those loyalty tokens and gobble them up, because as the game goes along, those are going to become more promiscuous around the table. They're going to be everywhere. At the beginning, there's not very many. It's hard for you to get off the ground. Your dragons are super weak. You're not going to fly them over there just to get killed. But as they kind of spread out, it's going to be hard for all the other players, to a certain degree, to kind of lock those down and sort of build forces without them also trying to go and spread and get to the stronghold. So there's a real interesting tension there. But having building up some power tokens, the Daenerys player, and then getting one or two of these Iron Bank cards is just going to give them that leg up, and kill some stuff, get a bunch of cool abilities, and then spread out, fly their dragons everywhere, and then gobble up the power tokens. I'd be curious how taking the Iron Bank out of the equation, seeing if you could still do that. So it's interesting kind of a power dynamic there, a certain balance discussion probably to happen there. But they're kind of random, right? There's a deck of them, and other people can get them too. So it's not like they're only available to Daenerys, who happens to be hoarding power tokens the whole game and then buys a bunch of cool stuff at the end and then wins. So that's interesting and curious. But like I said, and even the whole dynamic, like I said before, with Daenerys and spreading that stuff out, because it's hard to kind of build a front line against dragons that can fly behind your front line, go and snag a power token, fly back, and fly to safety, or fly to the next power token at the southern end of the board. You were already up there in Castle Black, and now you're going to fly down to wherever and get that next power token, or zoom all your dragons in there. Now you've got to have order tokens to do all that, because you're not always going to have all those move tokens. So you can't just fly them all everywhere and then leave your main fleet, so to speak, available. And of course, you are last on the turn track, which means you were most likely never, ever, ever going to get the vassal that you want to control, if there is vassals in the game, unless you can convince somebody to let you control that vassal for one turn. And because there's somebody else that looks like they're a problem. Okay, so so there's a lot of layers here. I hope you can kind of tell from my rambling. There's a lot of kind of interesting dynamics, and that's all going to be driven by the player discussion, negotiation, and bidding, and all that kind of cool stuff. I definitely recommend this. If you like the Game of Thrones board game, this is an obvious no. Probably already have it. If you kind of didn't like it, or maybe you played at a lower player count, it wasn't that satisfying an experience, but you really like Game of Thrones as an entity, then I highly recommend this. I would like some of those questions answered about how to mix in the other two mini expansions, and some folks' thoughts on the Iron Bank, and also on the the optional combat cards that come in the base game. I'm kind of curious what people think about that. But all in all, this is really this is like the Game of Thrones experience that you want. I've played the card game and some of the other smaller games and things, and the card game's pretty fun. I like that, but the living card game. But to me, this is the definitive Game of Thrones experience. And this really it's a solid game, by itself, where I wouldn't really ever want to play a diplomacy game or whatever the other game is I can't think of, or, like a Twilight Imperium or something. I would rather just probably play this, because I'm into the IP. I can kind of mentally get into the different houses that I'm playing, and kind of playing sort of in that spirit of how that house plays, and how my understanding is of their attitude and everything. So it's a high recommendation for me. It's an absolute no-brainer, like I said. So anyway, that's Mother of Dragons. Again, I'm curious about if some other folks have had a chance to play with some of the other little optional widgets and things like that. But yeah, take a look. Thanks.